He found her at dawn, broken, bloodied, belly heavy with life. The snow around her told the story before she could speak. Boot tracks, drag marks, and rage written in red. The mountain man had seen cruelty before, but not like this. Something in him long buried beneath years of solitude ignited. He didn't ask who did it. He didn't ask why. He just stood, silent as judgment itself, staring into the rising Sunday, knowing that before it set, someone's sins would meet their reckoning. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The dawn broke slow and gray across the mountain, the kind of light that bleeds rather than shines, seeping through the pines like a secret the world wasn't sure it wanted told. Eli Creed moved through that silence with the cautious rhythm of a man who had lived too long with ghosts. His boots whispered against the crusted snow, rifle slung low, eyes scanning the valley for sign of deer or danger. He'd spent 12 winters alone in these peaks, trapping, hunting, and trying to forget that men once called him something more than a mountain shadow. But that morning, something different caught his eye. A smear of color against the pale drift. Not the russet of a fox, not the brown of a fallen branch. Red, human red. He stopped, breath clouding the air, pulse heavy in his ears. The snow told the story before he reached her drag marks leading from the tree line, boot tracks deep and frantic, and a small patch where something or someone had struggled, then fallen still. He followed the trail, his instincts carrying him forward even as his mind whispered to turn back. And then he saw her, a woman, broken and bloodied, belly round beneath torn fabric, skin the color of moonlight. Her hair was tangled with pine needles, her lips cracked, her eyes half open but unfocused. She looked like she'd been left there to die, or to serve as a message. Eli knelt, the cold biting through his buckskins. "Ma'am," he said quietly, voice gravel rough from disuse. No response. He placed a calloused hand against her throat. A faint pulse, weak and fluttering. She was still in this world barely. Around her, the snow was painted with more than blood. There were impressions of fists, the prints of boots, and something else rage made visible. He glanced downhill, tracing the boot marks. 3 men, maybe 4. One set heavier, dragging slightly, someone large, maybe drunk, maybe wounded. Eli's jaw tightened. He'd seen cruelty before, seen what men do when they think the mountains will swallow the evidence, but not this. The woman's breath came shallow, a small gasp between shivers. Her fingers twitched against the snow, reaching for something unseen. He brushed the snow from her cheek and saw bruises blooming purple and blue, a cut along her temple crusted dark. Whoever had done this wanted her gone, but the mountains hadn't claimed her yet. Eli looked to the east, where the sun was just beginning to rise over the jagged horizon, spilling light that turned the blood in the snow to fire. For a long time, he stayed still, listening to the wind in the pines, to the faint rattle of her breath, to the steady, relentless beat of his own heart. He had built his life around silence, around staying clear of other people's trouble. But this was different. Something old and buried deep inside him stirred, something that had slept since the war and the graves it left behind. He didn't ask who did it. He didn't ask why. Some answers didn't need words. He looked again at the tracks leading downhill, then at the woman whose life flickered like a candle in the cold. The sun climbed higher, glinting off the rifle slung over his shoulder. "Not today," he murmured, voice almost a growl. Then he shrugged off his coat, wrapped it around her shaking form, and stared into the rising light, silent as judgment itself, knowing before that sun would set, someone's sins would meet their reckoning. The woman's breath rattled like dry leaves in the wind, shallow and uneven, the kind of sound a man hears when life is deciding whether to stay or go. Eli Creed crouched beside her in the dim light, the fire he'd built casting weak, flickering halos across her face. The flames licked at the cold air, fighting against the mountain's indifference. He'd wrapped her in his heavy buffalo coat, and still, her body trembled beneath it. For a long while, he just listened to the snap of pine wood, to the low moan of the wind winding through the pass, to the fragile rhythm of her breathing. Then, her lips moved. At first it was a whisper too faint to catch, a broken hum, but then he leaned closer, his ear nearly brushing her mouth. "Ash, Ford," she gasped. voice cracked like the surface of frozen earth. One word, no more, but it carried the weight of a world. Eli frowned. Ashford lay 2 days' ride south, a mining town that swallowed decency faster than whiskey. "Who's there?" he asked, but her eyes rolled back, her body going still again except for the faint rise of her chest. Eli sat back on his heels, staring into the fire. The name tugged at something: old maps, old memories of supply runs and hard men who made their living off cruelty. He rubbed his temples, feeling that familiar battle stirring in his gut. The mountain had taught him to stay out of men's business. Men brought ruin, and ruin brought ghosts. He'd buried enough of those to fill a valley. But the woman's face, there was something about it, even in pain, that unsettled the frost inside him. She was young, no more than 25, with dirt and blood streaking what might have once been a soft, kind expression. Her swollen belly shifted slightly under the coat, a life within a life still clinging to hope. Eli turned his head away, jaw tight, but the sound of her faint moan dragged his gaze back. He knew that tone. He'd heard it once before, on a battlefield, from a dying woman clutching her husband's hat. The memory hit him like a hammer. The smell of smoke, the cries, the helplessness. That was when he'd sworn off the world. That was when he'd walked into the mountains to forget. But now, here it was again, another plea carved out of suffering, demanding something from him he thought long dead. He sighed, heavy as stone, and reached into his pack for a flask. Tilting it to her lips, he coaxed a drop or two of water into her mouth. "Easy now," he muttered. "You hold on." The wind rose suddenly, whistling through the pines like a warning. Eli threw another log on the fire, watching the sparks drift up into the dark sky. He should have left. Should have turned north, back toward the ridges where no one needed saving. But as he watched her, something anchored him to that spot. Maybe it was the way her hand, bruised and trembling, had latched weakly onto the edge of his coat. Maybe it was the memory of a promise once made, and long broken. Whatever it was, it felt like chains and freedom all at once. He leaned forward, whispering low, his voice carrying on the wind. "You ain't dying out here, not while I'm breathing." Then he adjusted the fire, pulling it closer, guarding it like it was her heartbeat itself. The mountains around them held their silence, as if the earth itself had paused to listen. And for the first time in years, Eli Creed prayed to no one in particular. But with all he had left, the fire had burned low, nothing left but a soft orange glow licking at blackened wood. And in that quiet, Eli Creed's ghosts came crawling back from the corners of his mind like wolves drawn to blood. He worked in silence, cutting strips from his undershirt to bind Clara's wounds, his rough hands trembling just enough to betray the weight inside him. Each time the cloth touched her skin, he saw flashes not of her, but of another woman long gone, her hair the color of wheat, her laughter swallowed by gunfire and dust. That was the war, the one he'd marched into believing a man could stand between right and wrong and walk away clean. But justice, he'd learned, was a word made of smoke. He'd carried his rifle for men who spoke of honor, and when it was done, they left him with graves and a medal he buried beneath the roots of a pine. The mountain had taken him after that, taken everything soft in him and turned it to stone. Yet here he was, his calloused fingers smoothing her hair back, the scent of pine and iron mixing in the air, feeling something break loose deep inside his chest. He wrapped the last bandage, tied it firm, then sat back, the cold creeping in as the wind hissed through the trees. The moonlight hit her face, pale and still, and for a moment he thought she was gone. Then movement. A faint sound, breath trembling like the first note of a prayer. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy but alive. "Easy now," he murmured. Her gaze searched his, confused, afraid, but still burning with something stubborn. "Clara," she whispered, voice cracked but steadying. The name hung in the air, fragile as glass. "You're safe now," he said, though even he didn't believe it. Her hand moved toward her belly, protective, instinctive. He followed her eyes to the fire, its glow reflected in her tears. "They were after my husband," she said finally, her words halting, as though dragged from her throat by sheer will. "He didn't steal the Parmenas horse they said he did, but he didn't. They came to make him talk. He ran. She swallowed, pain twisting her face. They didn't find him. So they took their vengeance from me instead. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush the breath out of the night. Eli's jaw flexed, a muscle ticking near his temple. He wanted to speak, to tell her the world had no sense, no justice, but he'd already lived the proof of that. His eyes drifted to the tracks still visible beyond the firelight, those deep boot prints pressed into snow. He imagined their faces, the laughter, the cruelty, and his hands curled into fists around nothing. He'd seen men like them before, the kind who believed law was whatever weight their gun hand carried. He'd been one once, too, when rage had been his compass. But something in him shifted now, something quiet but unrelenting. He looked back at Clara, her breathing shallow, her eyelids fluttering with exhaustion. "Rest," he said softly. And when she did, he turned his eyes toward the darkness, where the trail disappeared into the trees. Once, he'd failed to deliver justice, and it had cost him everything. He could feel the memory like a scar beneath his ribs. This time, he swore, he wouldn't fail again. The fire crackled low, the wind howled through the ravine, and Eli Creed, mountain man, hermit, lost soul, became something else entirely. By morning, the wind had turned savage, the kind that clawed through fur and skin alike, shrieking down the slopes as though the mountain itself wanted to test his resolve. Eli Creed rose before the light, his breath fogging in the half-dark as he cut branches and lashed them with strips of rawhide to form a crude sled. His hands worked with the rhythm of survival, quick, efficient, relentless. Clara lay nearby beneath his coat, her skin as pale as the snow, her lips whispering sounds that barely formed words. When he leaned close, he caught fragments. Daniel, mercy, God forgive them. The last one twisted in his gut. He'd long stopped believing in mercy. Mercy was for men who hadn't seen what the world really was. By the time the sled was ready, his fingers were numb, his breath shallow. He eased her onto it, bundling her in blankets and furs, tightening the ropes until nothing loose could steal her warmth. The child inside her stirred faintly beneath the layers, a reminder that he was hauling not one life, but two, through the kind of cold that made death seem gentle. He set the rope across his shoulder, leaned forward, and began the descent. Each step broke through crusted snow. Each breath burned his lungs raw. The mountain gave no kindness. Its paths were steep, its ice slick with hidden dangers. Yet Eli moved as if driven by something more than flesh and bone. The wind tore at his hat, stung his eyes with frozen tears. But he didn't stop. Behind him, the sled hissed over the drifts, Clara murmuring faintly, her voice drifting in and out like wind through the pines. Sometimes she spoke to him. "You're kind," she whispered once, her tone soft and distant. "But kindness don't last out here." He didn't answer. Couldn't. He just grunted and pressed on, eyes narrowed against the glare. Around midday, the forest thinned. The air grew brittle with a silence that wasn't natural. Eli's senses sharpened the world around him too, still, too watchful. Then he heard it, a low, drawn-out howl from somewhere behind. Wolves. He turned, spotting gray shapes ghosting through the trees, eyes glinting like lanterns. Hunger rode with them. Clara stirred, frightened, as he dropped the rope and swung his rifle off his back. The first shot cracked through the cold, echoing across the valley. A flash of fur, a yelp, then silence again. He waited, breathing hard, fingers steady on the trigger. Two more emerged, cautious, circling wide. He fired once, twice clean, deliberate. They scattered into the shadows, their cries fading into the wind. When he turned back, Clara's eyes were open, wide and glistening. "They don't stop," she murmured, voice trembling. "Not the wolves, not the men." He swallowed hard, lowering his weapon. "No," he said finally, "but neither do I." He shouldered the rope again, pulling her forward through the white wilderness, his legs burning, his back screaming. The day bled into gray dusk, the kind that swallows all color until even blood looks black. Clara's voice faded again into dreamlike fragments, her husband's name. Something about forgiveness, something about the child never knowing what hate feels like. Each word carved deeper into Eli's silence. He didn't know if he was dragging her toward salvation or the grave, but he knew he couldn't stop. Somewhere beyond the ridge lay Ashford, and with it, the men whose tracks haunted the snow. The wind screamed one last time as night fell, but Eli Creed didn't hear it. He was too busy pulling against the weight of mercy itself. The valley stretched out before them, a hollow carved between dark ridges where the wind moved like a living thing, whispering through the brittle grass. Eli Creed found a cluster of stones and built a fire, coaxing reluctant sparks to life with numb fingers. The flames took slowly, then grew, throwing gold and scarlet light across the snow, and the battered shapes of man and woman huddled within its glow. He'd pulled Clara as far as her strength would allow. Now, she lay propped against a fallen log, wrapped in every scrap of warmth he owned. Her breath came shallow, her skin pale beneath smudges of soot and blood. Eli sat a few feet away, methodically stripping and cleaning his rifle. Each motion was deliberate steel against cloth, click of metal sliding home, soft rasp of the oiled bolt. He didn't need to think. His hands remembered. His muscles carried the ghosts of wars and hunts long past. He stared into the flames, and in their twisting light, the truth of what he meant to do burned just as fierce. Somewhere out there, beyond the valley's rim, he could hear them, the faint echo of men's laughter riding the wind. It was a sound too careless, too cruel to mistake. The kind of laughter that had no business existing in a world where good people bled. He froze mid-motion, head tilting slightly, eyes narrowing toward the sound. 3, maybe 4 voices. They were close enough for the wind to find them, but not close enough to see the glow of his fire. He knew their type. Their boots would be heavy with other people's pain, their knuckles still red with someone else's blood. His grip tightened around the rifle, the metal creaking under the pressure. The fire crackled, sending sparks swirling into the dark, and Clara's voice broke the silence. "Don't," she whispered, her tone weak but carrying the weight of something more than fear. Eli didn't look up. She tried again, louder this time, a fragile thread of resolve weaving through the pain. "Eli, don't do it. You'll lose yourself same as them." He exhaled through his nose, slow, steady, as though letting go of something that refused to die. "You don't know what they've done," he muttered. "I know enough," she said, her eyes reflecting the firelight like shards of glass. "Killing them won't bring anything back. Vengeance poisons what little good's left in the world." Her words fell like snow, soft, cold, impossible to hold. He looked at her then, really looked. The bruises along her throat, the marks on her wrists where they'd held her down. Her face too young to have seen this kind of cruelty. Something flickered in his gaze, a shadow of grief, of fury honed into something sharper than steel. "There's some things," he said quietly, almost to himself, "a man can't let pass." Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. She just turned her face toward the flames, their warmth painting her in fragile gold. The wind shifted again, carrying another burst of laughter from the hills, louder now, closer. Eli lifted his rifle, checked the sight, then laid it across his knees. The firelight danced along the barrel, bright and merciless. Clara closed her eyes, whispering a prayer into the dark. Eli Creed watched the sparks rise, one by one, into the vast black above, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a whisper carved from stone. "The world's already poisoned, Clara. I'm just giving it back its own medicine." And in that moment, as the wind carried the sound of his decision into the night, the firelight on his face looked less like warmth and more like confession. Ashford sat crouched in the valley like a wounded animal, half buried in its own filth and greed. The kind of place where men didn't look at one another too long for fear of seeing what they'd become. The wind had carried the stink of smoke and whiskey long before Eli Creed saw the first lantern light flicker against the snow. He came down the road slow, each step heavy with purpose, the cold clinging to his coat like old sin. Dust rose with the snow, curling around his boots as though the earth itself hesitated to touch him. Ashford was a mining town once, before the silver veins dried, and the men who stayed behind turned to meaner trades: extortion, liquor, flesh. Every window he passed was shuttered, though he could feel eyes tracking him through the cracks. He walked on, silent but certain, a shadow among shadows. By the time he hit the main street, the sun had fallen, leaving only the dull orange glow of the saloon lamps bleeding through frosted glass. Inside, muffled laughter spilled into the night, coarse and ugly, the kind born from a bottle and the suffering of others. Eli stopped beneath the swinging doors, brushed the frost from his beard, and stepped in. The saloon fell into a hush that wasn't quite silence, the kind where every sound is held on a knife's edge. A few men turned their heads, sizing him up the stranger's build, the rifle slung across his back, the dead calm in his eyes. He didn't meet their stares. Didn't have to. He moved to the bar, boots thudding on the warped boards, each step measured, deliberate. "Whiskey," he said. The barkeep, a wiry man with eyes like wet gravel, hesitated before pouring. "Ain't seen you before," he muttered. Eli downed the shot in one swallow, the burn doing nothing to thaw the ice inside him. "You won't again," he said quietly. The barkeep looked at him a long moment, then leaned in, voice dropping low. "You best turn back, stranger. Ashford don't take kindly to men askin' questions." Eli's gaze didn't waver. "I ain't askin'," he said. "I'm listenin'." A shadow flickered behind the bar, and one of the patrons, a big man with a scar across his jaw, laughed from a corner table. "You'll find plenty to listen to if you keep your ears open and your mouth shut." Eli's jaw tightened. He'd already found what he came for. 3 men sat at that table, boots up, cards in hand, the smell of whiskey strong enough to drown a man. The Kerns. He'd heard the name whispered on the trail, and now he saw them up close, brothers, blood thick with arrogance, the kind who mistook fear for respect. One of them wore a red scarf, frayed at the edge. Eli remembered seeing that same color smeared in the snow beside Clara's broken body. His pulse didn't quicken, it slowed. He stepped toward them, the room watching in silence. The eldest Kern looked up, lazy grin spreading across his face. "You lost, old-timer?" Eli stopped 2 paces from their table, his shadow stretching long in the firelight. "Found what I came for." The grin faltered just enough to show he'd noticed the rifle. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the door, a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo the heartbeat of the town itself. Ashford was no place for mercy. It was a place where the line between right and wrong was buried deep beneath boot prints and blood. And Eli Creed had come to dig it up. The moment stretched thin as wire, the air inside the saloon gone still enough to taste the dust. Eli Creed stood in the half-light, his shadow long and cold across the floorboards, his eyes locked on the 3 men who'd turned laughter into a weapon days ago on the mountainside. The Kerns looked up from their cards, half amusement, half disbelief, as though they couldn't quite imagine death walking through the front door wearing a trapper's coat. The eldest Tom Kern, broad as a bull and twice as mean, grinned, showing a gold tooth that glinted in the lamplight. "You lose something, old man?" he drawled, voice thick with whiskey and arrogance. Eli said nothing, just looked at him, long enough that the grin faltered. The middle brother snorted. "Ain't polite to stare." He kicked a chair aside, the wooden legs scraping sharp across the floor. The youngest, barely more than a boy, shifted in his seat, his fingers twitching near the pistol on his hip. Eli's hand stayed loose at his side, still, calm, deadly quiet. "You the ones came through the high ridge last week?" he asked finally, his voice low, even, each word measured like the toll of a bell. Tom squinted. "Maybe. Depends who's askin'." "Name was Clara," Eli said. "Just her name." The room seemed to shrink. The laughter died. A flicker of realization crossed Tom's face. Then he leaned back, forcing a chuckle that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ah, that one. Didn't figure anyone come lookin'. Thought she was long gone by now." His brothers laughed, low and mean. "Guess she weren't worth the trouble." Eli's jaw clenched, a muscle ticking like a clock counting down. The youngest brother Colt grinned wide, too young to understand what death looked like until it was already standing before him. "You got something to say about it, old-timer?" he jeered. Eli's voice was quiet enough that the wind outside could have carried it off. "No," he said. "I got something to finish." The middle brother, Duke, started to rise, hand slipping toward his belt. He never made it. The first shot split the silence like lightning through dry timber. One heartbeat later, Duke dropped, his chair tipping backward, the thud of his body swallowed by the echo of the gunfire. For a second, nobody breathed. Tom blinked, eyes wide with disbelief, then bellowed as he reached for his revolver, but Eli was already turned, already aimed, already firing. The second shot hit true, center chest, and Tom staggered back, the gold tooth flashing one last time before he collapsed into the table, scattering cards and blood across the whiskey-stained wood. The youngest brother scrambled to his feet, a hand pressed to his bleeding side, stumbling for the door. The room had emptied in a heartbeat, men ducking behind tables, women screaming, the piano gone silent mid-note. Eli followed the boy out into the street, boots echoing hollow on the boards. Snow was falling again, soft, soundless, like the world itself held its breath. The boy turned, eyes wild, the gun trembling in his hand. Eli raised his rifle, steady, his voice cutting through the cold like thunder through mountain air. That was for her. The shot rang out sharp and final, rolling through the valley until it became part of the wind itself. When the echo faded, only the snow moved, settling gently on the bodies cooling in the dust. Eli Creed lowered his rifle, exhaled once, and in that single breath, a reckoning was done. The storm had broken by the time Eli Creed reached the edge of the valley, but the silence it left behind felt heavier than thunder. Snow fell in slow, thick flakes that blurred the world into shades of gray, and every step back to camp was a fight against exhaustion and ghosts. The rifle hung limp in his hand, the weight of what he'd done trailing behind him like smoke. When he finally saw the faint glow of the dying fire through the trees, something in his chest tightened. Clara. He quickened his pace, boots crunching through the crusted snow. She lay where he'd left her, wrapped in blankets, her face pale as the drift beneath her. But her eyes, those eyes found him at once, bright with something wild and desperate. Eli. She breathed, her voice trembling between pain and relief. He dropped to his knees beside her, the ground cold enough to burn through his trousers. I'm here, he said, but his voice came out rough, useless. She grabbed his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong, her breath hitching as a wave of agony twisted through her. That's when he saw it, the sheen of sweat on her brow, the tremor in her belly. It hit him all at once. Her time had come. Panic clawed at the edges of his calm, but he shoved it down. There was no one else. No midwife, no healer. Just him and the woman who'd trusted him with her last hope. He laid his rifle aside, unwrapped the blankets, and did what he could, hands steady, though his heart thundered like hooves in his chest. The wind outside rose again, howling through the trees like a morning song. But inside their small circle of firelight, time folded in on itself. She gasped, cried out, bit down hard on her lip. He whispered what little comfort he knew, words that felt clumsy but earnest. You're strong, Clara, stronger than any of them. Her hand clutched his, and in her eyes burned the will of a mother fighting for two souls. Minutes passed, or hours, it was impossible to tell. The world narrowed to breath, pain, and prayer. Then, with a final, wrenching cry, the silence broke. A sound so small yet so fierce it shattered the stillness of the valley, a child's first cry. Eli froze, breath caught in his throat. Clara's head fell back against the furs, tears glistening on her lashes as a trembling smile spread across her face. Eli lifted the infant, tiny, red, alive, and felt a heat bloom in his chest that he hadn't known existed anymore. It's a boy, he said softly, his voice trembling. Clara reached for the child, her hand brushing the edge of the blanket. Hope, she whispered, her voice faint as wind. Name him Hope. He swallowed hard, nodding, unable to speak. She smiled again, weakly, her eyes drifting toward the horizon where the first streaks of dawn painted the snow in fire. You found it, Eli, she murmured, almost to herself. You found hope. Her eyes closed. Her hand went still. The fire popped once, sending sparks into the quiet. Eli sat there, the newborn cradled against his chest, the weight of life and death balanced in his arms. The sun climbed over the ridge, casting a blood-red light across the frozen world, and he stared into it, unblinking. The same sun that had witnessed her suffering now rose on something new, a promise, fragile and fierce. Eli Creed, killer and sinner, held that promise close, the child's heartbeat steady against his own. The morning after the storm broke clear and sharp, the kind of cold that cut through silence and left the world hollow and clean. Eli Creed moved slow, each motion deliberate, his body heavy with exhaustion and something far deeper. Clara lay still, her face peaceful now, the pain gone but her absence roaring louder than any wind. The child slept against his chest, wrapped tight in his fur-lined coat, a small ember of life in a world of frost and ashes. Eli dug the grave with his hands first, then with the blade of his old shovel, the frozen ground fighting him every inch of the way. Each strike rang out across the valley like a confession. The sun climbed slow, spilling weak light across the snow as he worked, his breath coming in ragged clouds. When at last the hole was deep enough, he lifted her body light now, too light, and carried her to the grove of aspens that stood just beyond the ridge. Their white trunks shimmered in the morning sun, and when the wind passed through them, it made a sound like soft weeping. He laid her there, beneath the tallest tree, its roots anchored deep in the heart of the mountain. He covered her gently, the earth dark against the snow, then fashioned a cross from 2 fallen branches bound with a strip of leather from his pack. There were no words spoken, no prayers, just a silence so profound it swallowed the sound of the world. He stood over her grave for a long while, the rifle slung across his back, the child's small breaths warming the hollow beneath his chin. Justice, he thought, was never clean. It stained the soul as surely as blood did the snow. What he'd done back in Ashford, the 3 men, their laughter silenced forever, should have brought peace, but all he felt was the weight of it pressing deeper into him. The wind shifted, brushing against the cross, and he imagined her voice in it, faint but steady. "Don't lose yourself." He closed his eyes, the memory of her smile burning against the dark. For the first time in years, Eli Creed wept. The tears came without sound, freezing on his cheeks before they could fall. He hadn't known he still could. When the child stirred, a small cry cutting through the stillness, Eli looked down at the boy, Clara's boy. Hope and something inside him changed. The trail behind him, the one that led back into the mountains and solitude, waited like an old friend, promising quiet, safety, nothingness. But when he turned toward it, he saw only emptiness stretching on forever. Ahead, beyond the ridge, lay Ashford again, broken but alive, a place that needed mending more than hiding. Between the 2 paths, the wind howled, carrying with it the weight of choice. Eli shifted the child higher against his chest, his jaw set. "You and me, kid," he muttered, voice rough but steady. "We ain't running from ghosts no more." He looked one last time at the grave, the sunlight glinting off the cross, and then turned his back on it, not to forget, but to carry it with him. As he started down the slope, the aspen leaves whispered softly, their sound like a benediction. Behind him lay what was done. Ahead waited what might still be redeemed. And though his heart was heavy, the boy in his arms slept peacefully, unaware that somewhere in the heart of the mountains, a broken man had chosen the harder road and perhaps, in doing so, found the first step toward grace. Weeks passed, and winter began to ease its grip on the valley, though the mountains still held their crowns of snow. The river below Ashford thawed first, cutting through the ice with the sound of freedom, low, steady, relentless. Along its banks, a small cabin took shape, rough-hewn logs stacked with care, smoke curling from a crooked chimney that smelled of pine and coffee. The townsfolk who ventured that far spoke in hushed tones about the man who lived there, a quiet figure with a weathered face, a rifle leaned always within reach, and a newborn wrapped against his chest in furs. Some said he was a ghost from the war, others a hermit who'd wandered too far from God, but those who saw him up close spoke differently. They said his eyes were no longer empty. They said he carried something that wasn't grief anymore, something gentler, something alive. Eli Creed had built his life out of solitude and regret. But now, his days were marked by smaller things. Feeding the boy, splitting wood, tending to the fire when the wind grew cruel. At night, he would sit by the river with the child in his arms, telling stories in a voice the baby couldn't yet understand, stories of the stars, of rivers that never stopped running, of people who found ways to be better than the world allowed. He called the boy Hope, just as Clara had asked, and each time he said the name, it felt less like a burden and more like a prayer. The town of Ashford, for all its sins, began to change in small ways too. The saloon where the Kerns had once ruled grew quieter, its laughter dimmer. The sheriff, an old man with a limp and a conscience long neglected, rode out to Eli's cabin one morning, not to question him, but to bring supplies. "Heard you're raising the child," he'd said, handing over a sack of flour. "World could use more of that." Eli had only nodded, eyes steady, his gratitude wordless but clear. The rumors spread faster than truth often does. Some said the mountain man had taken to preaching to the wind, others that the ghost of the woman he'd buried watched over the cabin at night. But those who truly listened knew the truth was simpler. A man once ruled by anger had found something stronger. In the mornings, before the light fully touched the peaks, Eli would step outside with the boy nestled close and watch the sun climb over the ridge. The fire in the east would spill across the valley, setting the river ablaze with gold. He would close his eyes, breathe deep the cold air, and whisper to the wind, "The world can be cruel, but it doesn't have to stay that way." It wasn't a sermon or an oath. It was a reminder. The wind carried his words across the snowfields and down into Ashford, where folks claimed the air felt different that winter cleaner somehow, as though something had lifted. Maybe it was just a story, or maybe it was truth wearing a simple man's coat. Either way, they said the West itself seemed to breathe easier. And in that cabin by the river, Eli Creed, the man who'd once buried his soul in the mountains, sat rocking a child as the firelight flickered against the walls, his eyes reflecting not ghosts anymore, but something far rarer: forgiveness.